So this presentation is going to discuss how music and math are related to one another. And I picked this topic because it's widely researched. Math and music are inherently related, and we're going to discuss a little bit about how they are and how they're not. And it's personally relevant to me as a math teacher and also a former musician. I studied piano and viola for about 10 years each growing up. So this is very exciting for me to see how these two disciplines connect to one another. So my research question is, how can musical instruction enhance the teaching of mathematical concepts, skills, and habits of mind? So we're going to look at fractions, proportional reasoning, and transformations as mathematical concepts. We're going to look at skills like inductive reasoning, which is pattern seeking, and deductive reasoning, which is applying rules. And we're going to look at, very briefly, persistence and attitude and how these things might be shaped by music. So let's take a look at the research. So many correlative studies have found that students who study music demonstrate greater academic achievement than students who do not. A lot of people assume this is because there's a lot of overlap of math and science concepts with music. So when we think about musical notes, that's how we divide rhythm. That's a very mathematical concept, and science helps us explain how music is produced. But while that may seem very elusive and exciting, we have to remember that correlation does not mean causation. So when you take away variables such as demographics, prior academic achievement, the duration of musical study, and attitudes towards school, suddenly the link disappears. So now there's no correlation between your study of music and your academic achievement. There are studies that show some evidence of a correlation. So Graziano, Peterson, and Shaw in 1989 did a study with 237 second graders in a low socioeconomic status environment. This is a school in the inner city. And they had students in three groups. One group received math video game training as well as piano keyboard training. A second group received math video game training and English language training. And then a third group received no special training at all and served as a control group. So the comprehensive pre and post tests were given to students to measure their proportional and spatial reasoning. And group 1, which is this top one here, outperformed group 2, and both of these groups did better than the control group. So the main idea here is that this study provides evidence that the addition of musical instruction does improve mathematical performance. But the limitations of this study is that it's a quasi-experimental design. There wasn't any random assignment for these three groups, so that does lend some questions about the validity of these results. So future studies should include random assignment. And let's look at an example of evidence against the connection between musical instruction and mathematical gains. So here's Sala and Gobet in 2017 had participants in three experimental groups, one group receiving musical training, one receiving chess training, and one receiving working memory training. All of these different groups were found to improve cognitive processes, but those cognitive processes didn't transfer among domains. So basically, the students who got the music training did better in musical applications, but didn't move to chess and working memory training, and vice versa. So the long story short is that this study suggests that musical instruction is going to enhance cognitive function, but only in the domain where that training occurs. So if you want to be better at something, practice that thing. And this is a little bit this pushes back against a lot of the assumptions that people have about the relationship between math and music. So a meta-analysis was conducted to analyze the research because there is so much research out there. So Fugos in 2017 states that the most poorly designed studies showcase the largest effects. The studies with improved designs show weaker effects, and the studies with the strongest designs of all show the weakest effects of all. So there's an inverse relationship between the quality of the study and the impressiveness of the results. So the most common problem that this researcher found was that the control group was often doing nothing, which we actually saw back here, right? This no special training control group. And the problem there is that it could create an enthusiasm gap. So you could have the control group being disengaged because they're not being provided an activity, and perhaps that disengagement is causing the results to be negative. Then there's also a placebo effect. So we've also got people, perhaps teachers and or students, who are expecting certain results, and that can also impact the results. So keeping that in mind, the meta-analysis does not provide any conclusive information about the relationship between musical study and math study in two separate domains helping one another. So let's look a little bit at how math and music overlap, because while it's not showing up in the research, there are still some areas of overlap, and we want to discuss what those are, and that might lend some credence into what we can connect math and music efficiently and effectively. So let's look at the concept of fractions and musical theory. Fractions are one of the most important topics covered in elementary and middle school, and it's one of the benchmark skills to help students develop proportional reasoning. So as we think of fractions, we think of a numerator and a denominator. So we think of how much of a whole is something taking up. So that whole in music is represented as a measure. So in 4/4 time, which is the most traditional way in which we divide up music, a whole note is going to take up the whole measure, and that's going to have 4 beats. Half note is going to take up half the measure, so we're going to take those 4 beats and split it up. The first 2 beats are here, and the second 2 beats are here. And notice that this image is physically representing half of a circle. So what we're doing is we're connecting musical theory, represented by these images here, and we're connecting it with more traditional representations of fractions. And so the teacher here is making an explicit connection between a student's learning in math class and a student's learning in music class. That's a little bit different than what we were talking about earlier, where we were focusing training in one domain and then checking to see if it transferred to another domain. And that's not what's happening here in the classroom. In the classroom here, the teacher is explicitly saying, look at how these two things are related. So this is very different from the research we were seeing before. And the reason I stress that is because I want to say that just because the research didn't show that studying music created a change in your math doesn't mean that math can't be used, music and math can't be taught together. So let's look at a concept overview of symmetry, transformations, and musical theory. Symmetry is a mathematical property in which one image can be moved, flipped, or rotated to match another image. So taking a look at this letter A, we can take a dividing line right through the center. This piece could be mapped perfectly on top of this piece. We just reflect it over the line, and voila, they would match. Same thing with this trapezoid. This is a horizontal line of symmetry. We could flip this up, and they would land perfectly on top of each other, and therefore this is a line of symmetry. So symmetry is a very visual property of shapes, and we can see symmetry showing up in music. So I've used this example of Ode to Joy by Beethoven, which is one of the most famous pieces of music, his Ninth Symphony. And I want to show you where symmetry shows up in the music. So I'm going to click on this, and you can see right here we've got E, E, F, G, G, F, E, right? So these 3 notes, 1, 2, 3, 3, 2, 1, are ascending and then falling, and they're a perfect mirror image of each other, almost like the letter A. Okay, so that's an example of a reflection, just like we have over here. And then we have something called a translation, and a translation shows up when we're dealing with geometric figures on the coordinate plane or functions on the coordinate plane. And that's where we take something and we shift it up or down without changing the shape. And we can actually see this in the music as well. So we've got right here, E, E, F, G, and then it falls. And then we have C, C, D, E, and we've got exactly the same structure where it's 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3, but everything's transposed down 2 notes. So I've got a little bit of that piece here that I'm just going to play for you for a little bit, and I'm going to move the cursor so that way you can see exactly where the music is as I click play. Okay, and then we're going to go on to another example. The next thing that we're going to discuss is patterns, and patterns underlie math and music both. And this TED Talk is going to discuss a little bit about how patterns show up in math and music. We're not going to have time to watch the whole thing, but I do encourage you to watch it on your own time. But I'm going to give us just a minute or two of this so that way you can see the connection between math and music, and specifically in reference to patterns, and also what it would look like if we didn't have those patterns.
So what makes a piece of music beautiful? Well, most musicologists would argue that repetition is a key aspect of beauty. The idea that we take a melody, a motif, a musical idea, we repeat it, we set up the expectation for repetition, and then we either realize it or we break the repetition. And that's a key component of beauty. So if repetition and patterns are key to beauty, then what would the absence of patterns sound like if we wrote a piece of music that had no repetition whatsoever in it? That's actually an interesting mathematical question. Is it possible to write a piece of music that has no repetition whatsoever? It's not random. Random is easy. Repetition-free, it turns out, is extremely difficult. And the only reason that we can actually do it is because of a man who was hunting for submarines. It turns out a guy who was trying to develop the world's perfect sonar ping solved the problem of writing pattern-free music. And that's what the topic of the talk is today.
So, we won't have time to go through the whole thing, but basically, the answer to this musical problem was found through a completely different but analogous problem that was much more scientific and mathematical in nature. So the fact that we can use mathematical and scientific thinking to solve musical problems shows the inherent structure that underlies both of these disciplines. Unfortunately, this is a little bit of a harder thing to quantify and measure, so there isn't as much research about it as there is academic achievement. The ability to assess a student's underlying understanding of a pattern has to be operationalized in a concept, so it gets a little bit messier, and unfortunately, this one's not as easy to find more hard research about. Now, one famous connection between music and math is called the Mozart effect, and you might have already heard about that. So Roscher, Shaw, and Kai in 1994 conducted 2 studies which found that college students who listened to Mozart performed better on spatial reasoning tasks than students who did not. So that created a whole span of literature. This book by Don Campbell called The Mozart Effect for Children. And then we've got this Music for Babies, which there's multiple volumes of it. The problems with this research was that the cognitive gains lasted only about 10 or 15 minutes. The research was not replicable, even though about 40 or more studies have since tried to replicate it. None have been successful to any significant degree. The implications were overgeneralized, and commercialized. So the fact that we were dealing with college students here, but suddenly the idea is that, pregnant women can listen to Mozart and improve the cognitive functioning of their future baby was a huge leap, and it was wildly unfounded. Last but not least, though, we do want to take a step away, and we want to think about music as a tool for math instruction. So the central question is, can learning math through music help students absorb and retain mathematical information better? So this takes it away from what we were discussing earlier as a means of transfer, right? The first question that we looked at the beginning of this presentation was, when you study math, does that create better musicians and vice versa? Does studying music create better mathematicians? Now what we want to think about is explicit instruction of one domain using the other. So again, we are explicitly connecting it from the teacher's perspective. So Carolyn Jones in 2018 reports that one teacher named Tammy Jorgensen, who's a middle school math teacher from California, saw significant growth on her students' standardized assessment scores only when she began writing and teaching songs for every algorithm that students were expected to master. So in fact, she said she had over 100 songs that she teaches on an annual basis to her students, and it has vastly improved their assessment scores on annual Smarter Balanced assessments. So those are not teacher-written assessments. They are standardized measures. And then Catherine Yoho conducted an action study which found that students did learn faster and retained longer their mathematics information when the content was presented and repeated using music. So that's pretty persuasive. Now that might lead us to the question, why would music help us learn math? Well, our memories are stored in the same part of our brain that process music and emotion. So music, memory, and emotion are all closely related to one another. The Mozart effect, which we talked about earlier, has been widely debunked as a means of making individuals smarter, but it has been shown to positively correlate with arousal and mood. And so maybe that might explain some of the findings that the first 1994 set of 2 studies found. It doesn't explain why they weren't replicated, but the fact that we've found a positive correlation between arousal and mood might mean that there are some third variables at play. So based on my research, here are some things that I'm thinking about right now. Music might actually help us remember individual math facts, which can then help people make connections between what seem like discrete topics and ultimately build a system of knowledge. Because good mathematics is interdependent. It's the idea that we can represent the same information multiple ways and see how it all connects. But a lot of people don't get to that point, and all they can see are the little discrete algorithms. So maybe if students can remember the individual algorithms better, they start to notice underlying patterns. That might be one theory. Another thing that I'm thinking about is maybe higher arousal facilitates acquisition of information or performance of a skill better, and that might be temporary, which was why those results only lasted 10 to 15 minutes. But maybe it's the ability to be attentive, right, that is causing some of these skill gains or apparent skill gains. And it's not actually that your brain is working that differently, it's just that you are more focused while you are doing a certain task. And last but not least, the fact that there's improved mood, right? Maybe the mood is going to create more endurance or persistence or positivity on the part of the participant. And so if you are enjoying something or if you are less miserable doing an action, maybe you're going to persevere a little bit longer, and it's the perseverance that's going to actually create a better outcome. So it could be that a habit and not a cognitive process is really at work. Now, there's a lot of information out there, and hopefully some of the researchers have started to work on these things, but this is where I would recommend future research to go, so that way we can discuss and get some more clarity on those topics. So, final debrief, some key takeaways. Math and music do have a conceptual and structural overlap. So the concepts that we talked about were fractions and transformations, and that underlying structure are patterns. We know that learning in one domain has not been shown to directly transfer to another domain. Most studies which report a positive transfer are in fact poorly designed and can't be trusted. But the addition of music to mathematical instruction can enhance acquisition and retention of mathematical procedures. So really, this is what we want to look at going forward. We really want to see how can we explicitly connect music and mathematics together in a single classroom in order to support one another in students' gains. So thanks so much for listening. Here are my image sources, and if you want to check out the bibliography, that will be attached separately. Thanks again.